All right, good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yousef Munayyer. I'm the head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. We apologize for the slightly late start this morning, just trying to iron out some of the technical issues behind the scenes, making sure all of our panelists can see and hear us well. But we're ready to get started now, and we thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. Washington targets dissent, repression from the academy to the streets. The Trump administration's policies towards universities and protesters has been characterized as the biggest assault on civil liberties in the United States since the Second Red Scare, or the era of McCarthyism. Some of the nation's most esteemed universities have been targeted by the administration with punitive measures aimed at forcing changes that would gut their academic freedom. Students who protested Israeli policies and American support for the war on the people of Gaza have been summarily detained by masked agents and disappeared. Today, Arab Center Washington, D.C. has convened this webinar panel of experts to discuss these unfolding developments, and we'll seek to address several questions. What have the impacts of these policies been so far? And where do we expect things to go? What have the legal responses been? What are institutions doing and how are they responding? What is the origin of all these policies and how did we get to such a place? And how is immigration law and federal education policy being used in all of this? We're very fortunate to have a wonderful group of experts to talk through these questions with us and more today. For our conversation, we'll begin with 10 minutes of introductory remarks from each of our panelists, followed by moderators' questions and then Q&A with our audience. Please note that you don't need to wait for the Q&A portion to submit your questions to this morning's speakers. You can send in questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by sending them in via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. In the interest of time, I want to move to directly and briefly introducing our guests now in the order that they will be presenting their introductory remarks and then starting our discussion. Asli Bali is president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and Howard M. Holtzmann Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Tariq Habash is co-founder and director of A New Policy and a former policy advisor in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. Lara Friedman is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and Abed Ayoub is national executive director at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Welcome, all of you, and thank you for being with us today. Asli, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Yousef, and thank you for inviting me and organizing this panel. I'm, delighted to join, and I'm going to speak not just from my perspective as a professor at Yale Law School, but maybe more distinctly from the vantage point I've had as the president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, the largest scholarly association of academics working in the English language and the languages of the Middle East on the Middle East and the social sciences and humanities. And we have watched with alarm the Trump administration's attacks on academic freedom, but I want to begin first with what the sort of groundwork that was laid under the Biden administration and even before that. But for the purposes of our current panel, I'm just going to begin with events at university campuses beginning in October 2023 when protests against the Israeli bombardment of Gaza and U.S. financial and military support to the Israeli military, together with concerns about university investments in Israel, sparked widespread protests across campuses that grew from the fall of 2023 through the spring of 2024. I mentioned this period because much of the groundwork was laid for the conceptual idea that both anti-discrimination law and regulation of education could be used as a mechanism to intervene aggressively on university campuses to police speech and assembly. During the Biden administration, the response to campus protests and these activities set a precedent that already threatened university autonomy, freedom of speech, and academic freedom, as did efforts by Republicans in Congress engaging in political theater, most notably by convening public hearings to interrogate and castigate university presidents about protests on their campuses, all of which preceded the Trump administration. Specifically, the weaponization of anti-discrimination law as a means of silencing dissent by characterizing pro-Palestine protests as intrinsically anti-Semitic was sort of conceptualized in this period, and the efforts to turn opposition to anti-Semitism into a tool to suppress criticism of Israel by equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism even precedes this period. The idea that a definition of anti-Semitism should be adopted at the federal level that engages in this equation, that treats all criticism of Israel as intrinsically anti-Semitic, was something that was being advocated for over the last decade by a variety of actors and organizations, and that had taken hold in the first Trump administration in an executive order that he had adopted directing the Department of Education to use such a definition, and was built upon, regrettably, by the Biden administration. Of course, the problem with the use of this kind of weaponization of opposition to anti-Semitism is that instead of addressing real acts of discrimination, it instead blurs the line between discrimination and debates about the politics of the Middle East in ways that then had very serious implications for universities. Moreover, under the Biden administration, we saw a multi-pronged assault on freedom of speech and assembly and academic freedom on campuses that really amounted to a public-private partnership. On the one hand, elements in the Biden administration and Republicans in Congress were determined to use these kinds of definitions to suppress speech. And on the other hand, private actors mobilized donors, alums, and entreated boards governing universities to take into account their demands to see these speech and dissent suppressed on campuses at the risk of losing private funding to universities. And boards at universities, particularly in light of the sort of neoliberal turn in higher education in general in the United States, really were more attentive to ideas about return on investment as the principal way to understand the value of higher education, rather than commitments to knowledge production, research, academic freedom, or the autonomy of universities. And as a consequence, you saw a growing partnership between right-wing donors and other private funders and the boards of universities working together to essentially suppress speech on campuses. In a sense, this is a way in which the political economy of higher education around the neoliberal university collided with a right-wing effort to foment essentially cultural revolution. Well before October 7th, dozens of states with Republican-dominated legislatures and governors, like Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis, Texas's Governor Greg Abbott, proposed laws or executive orders banning things like the teaching of critical race theory, or, for example, determining that certain ideas are divisive concepts that are to be suppressed. Properly understood, the efforts to repress speech on campuses around Palestine, around criticism of Israel, are an extension of this broader campaign against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, against divisive concepts, against any ideas that are opposed by right-wing actors. And in this instance, these actors have weaponized legitimate worries about anti-Semitism to advance their project of suppressing viewpoints that are disfavored by groups outside of the university and to fight against important diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts. The results well before the Trump administration was elected on campuses were selective enforcement of rules, prior restraint on events, weaponization of university disciplinary procedures against students and faculty that held disfavored views, the banning of student groups through bespoke rules applied on an ad hoc basis based on their viewpoint, the censoring of syllabi, curricula, and speech on campuses for content related to Israel-Palestine. That was the picture before the election. What now we have seen is a qualitative and quantitative radical escalation by the Trump administration of these kinds of moves. This began with executive orders, including an executive order directly targeting foreign students and scholars on the basis of their expressed speech and pro-Palestinian views. The executive order specifically, again, doubling down on partnerships or attempts to induce collaboration, creating a kind of incentive scheme by which universities were deputized to engage in repressive conduct on behalf of the government, the executive order encouraged universities to, quote, monitor and report activities by foreign students, that specifically their speech and assembly, and to impose harsh disciplinary consequences against those who were engaging in pro-Palestinian speech. In addition, the Trump administration created a special task force on anti-Semitism. The membership of the task force is quite opaque. We know that the Department of Justice is leading the task force, and the leadership of the task force is coming from the Department of Justice, but the Department of Health and Human Services, maybe even the Department of State, certainly the Department of Education, perhaps other departments are also included. And the task force is taking this kind of conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and turning it into a basis to regulate all of campus life and university life across the country. How has this unfolded? On the one hand, using existing anti-discrimination law under Title VI by charging the Department of Education to initiate investigations against over 60 universities, threatening them with funding cuts and losses on the basis of allegations of anti-Semitism, but separately initiating another investigation led by the task force I mentioned in the Department of Justice of 10 universities on criminal allegations of alleged anti-Semitism. These efforts in the background, drawing on the executive orders and also the aggressive reinterpretation of existing anti-discrimination law, were accompanied by individualized targeting of particular universities, beginning with Columbia University, which received an extraordinary set of demands from the Trump administration, reaching deep into the governance of that campus and demanding that it capitulate or collude with the Trump administration on its goals to abolish departments, place faculty and students under direct supervision, essentially take over first a receivership of a department, but now effectively a receivership of the university as a whole. Regrettably, Columbia acceded to these demands. In some instances, its board appeared to share some of the motivations of the Trump administration to use this moment to repress speech, faculty activity, departments, scholarship that they disfavored. Ultimately, that capitulation, the willingness to comply with Trump administration demands, achieved little for Columbia University, which continued to be targeted by even more invasive measures and effectively was required to replace its already acting president with a new president, this time drawn directly from its board. In addition to this kind of individualized targeting of universities, there has been the dismantling of all of the infrastructure of the Department of Education, attacking the fundamental infrastructure of federal funding for academic research, leaving intact only those elements of the Department of Education that can join task force efforts to investigate universities, but none of the proactive and positive support to higher education that the Department of Education had originally been created to facilitate. There were further targeted funding cuts targeting Columbia, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Northwestern, Brown University, and more. The numbers increase on an alarming basis of universities being individually targeted. But of course, there are also massive across-the-board cuts to funding in education and scientific research. The National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and others have simply ended existing, already awarded grants to universities across the country, sometimes in connection to punitive measures allegedly on the basis of the investigations I mentioned earlier, although those investigations for the most part have barely begun, and in other instances simply in an across-the-board cut to research funding in the United States. In addition to all of these measures, as Yousef alluded to in his introductory remarks, immigration law has also been weaponized. And as I mentioned, the first executive order directly threatened and targeted foreign students and scholars, and that's been followed by a mass series of visa revocations. There's no official count of the numbers of visa revocations in question, but independent researchers have been able to document clear evidence of as many as 1,800 visas that have already been revoked for individual foreign students and scholars, and more generally, a threat to cut universities off from SEVIP, the program that allows them to enroll foreign students at all. And now we've had the most recent executive orders and statements of this week, which are targeting further elimination of all diversity-based practices at universities and introducing a new politicization of accreditation of universities and colleges across the country, now repurposed for ideological ends. Finally, Harvard University, which has been targeted by another set of demand letters, has been informed that its tax-exempt status as a university, its ability to benefit from tax exemptions on the basis of its contributions to the public interest of the American public through its activities in research and knowledge production may also be at risk. So what are the implications of all of these demands? Every university in the country is now on notice that it may lose its tax exemption. It may be subjected to a politicized accreditation process. It may lose its ability to enroll foreign students. It will lose all funding, whether in the humanities or social sciences or in the hard sciences, around research support from the federal government, and that many of the programs, labs, experimental sciences, work of the university that depended on that funding stream that had already been committed will now have to be summarily terminated. This is not just the worst assault on U.S. higher education since the Red Scare. It is actually the most substantial assault in the history of U.S. higher education. There is simply no precedent for this. The existing precedents, such as the Red Scare, ideologically motivated crackdowns on speech and assembly, did not reach all of funding of research, all of the ways in which the federal government is involved in regulating education across the board, et cetera, tax exemption. I mean, the scale and scope of what's being undertaken here is effectively a declaration of war on America's colleges and universities, demanding that they bow to demands of the Trump administration on what they teach, who they can admit, who they hire. And it's a war on knowledge production. It's not just chilling of free speech and academic freedom. It is a set of ideological shackles on the possibility of doing research in the United States. Regrettably, the response from some universities has been compliance and capitulation, which in many respects is simply colluding because, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, universities led by boards that prioritize return on investment over the fundamental mission and vocation of higher education are happy to sacrifice elements of the university to the government's ideological project in order to retain what they understand to be the sort of high investment, high capital elements of research, whether it's in AI or engineering or the business school or what have you, professional and vocational schools. This calculus, of course, is entirely wrong, as is made evident by the cuts to hard sciences across the board from the NSF and the NIH. All of these measures are subject to legal challenge, and many of them openly violate the Constitution, including, of course, most notably the First Amendment. But in order to place obstacles to the government's attempts to engage in this illegal conduct, one has to be willing to pursue those legal challenges. The very schools that are under attack are being governed by boards that in many instances have made a calculus that it is not prudent to engage in those legal challenges. And so in many instances, these illegal actions, this kind of government overreach is standing. What has been the response so far from different sectors of the academy, and I will stop at the end of these comments, there has been attempts to organize across the sector of higher education. Most recently, just yesterday, the American Association of Colleges and Universities issued a statement signed onto by over 150 college and university presidents opposing the unprecedented government overreach and political interference that was endangering American higher education. The American Association of University Professors has gone much further, as has the Middle East Studies Association, which I lead. We have filed lawsuits. We had the first hearing just yesterday in Massachusetts in a case that is seeking to enjoin the administration from continuing its policy of ideological deportations of foreign students and scholars. The AAUP has also stepped in and filed a lawsuit on behalf of its Columbia University members, opposing the funding cuts that university has been subjected to. And of course, most notably, Harvard is the first university that has openly expressed that it is unwilling to comply with the demands that have been put to it by the Trump administration and has initiated a lawsuit of its own. But these are very incipient measures, and the reality is that we are in a universe in which it is unclear yet whether this sector, the sector of higher education, or any sector is willing to act in its own defense against this unlawful and unprecedented attack.
Thank you very much, Asli, for that very thorough set of introductory remarks on this issue. I want to now turn it over to Tariq Habash, who is co-founder of A New Policy and also formerly worked at the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. Tariq, I'm really interested to hear sort of your view on how you're seeing federal education policy being used at this moment, and yeah, what you make of it all and what you think is still to come. So please, Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Yousef, for the invitation to be part of this conversation. It's always great to be in community with you and with our panelists and hearing Asli talk about all of the different intricacies of what she's doing with her work is obviously really important and impactful. This is a really timely issue. It's extremely urgent for us to be talking about it, not just because of higher education being under attack and at risk, but really for anyone who has concerns about American democracy, about our institutions, and our ability to have ideas exist without state control. And what's happening now, I think also really hit the nail on the head. This is an attack on free thought, on idea generation. And for us to be able to have this space of free expression and academic freedom, it's not just about campus issues. These are matters of public policy. And in the last few months, and frankly, in recent years, federal education policy has become a very powerful tool. And frankly, it has become a weapon for political actors who want to police discourse, who want to criminalize dissent, and reshape what it looks like to have institutions of education. And so the federal government's primary lever is ultimately money. At the end of the day, the Department of Education has really broad discretion to condition the disbursement of federal funds, particularly federal student loans and Pell Grants, which are governed by what's known as Title IV of the Higher Education Act. And by extension, essentially works with accrediting agencies to determine what institutions are going to be eligible for those billions and billions of dollars that flow from the government to institutions every single year. And in addition to that, there are a lot of different regulations that are attached to that funding. Some of those regulations, many of you have probably heard about, and have worked directly with, like the Civil Rights Act and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, and the different contracts that govern how colleges and universities have to make sure they are complying with federal law under the Higher Education Act. All of these rules and regulations have existed for decades and apply to schools, and there is a compliance structure that exists that colleges and universities interact with the government to make sure that they are in compliance. When they're not in compliance, there are essentially improvement plans to help ensure that they get into compliance. But at the same time, there are different offices in the Department of Education that govern this work, that enforce these statutes, that mandate the protection of students from discrimination and uphold like the department's primary mission of providing an equal opportunity to a high quality education. And this is what really has been weaponized in recent months, because what we are seeing is not only the dismantling of the Department of Education by the Trump administration through reductions in force to make it harder for the department to actually ensure compliance and accountability from the 6,500 plus colleges and universities that are eligible for federal aid, but it is also what the Trump administration is attempting to do by dismantling the agency is by consolidating its power and being able to leverage that influence through political means. So instead of having robust investigations when there are complaints about possible discrimination, having, experts on civil rights law visit campuses, understand the narrative of exactly what happened and make a legal determination, what you're seeing is a political apparatus say, hey, this isn't what we want you to do. We want you to do this. We want you to apply this very, very aggressively. And if you don't do it, we're just going to cut you off. There's no due process. There's no opportunity for dialogue exchange between the institution and the government. There's no dialogue exchange between the students and faculty, what they've experienced, and the government. It's just hearsay. It's just whatever the government wants to happen is going to happen. And if you don't comply, then they're going to cut off your funding and your resources. So this is what's happening right now. And we're in a critical moment now, but this isn't something that just started happening. This has been facilitated over years. In 2019, the Trump administration issued an executive order to threaten funding to colleges and universities who failed to, quote unquote, protect free speech. This was very much targeted at progressive policy ideas and Palestine advocacy in particular. Their effort was very clear, and this wasn't just the Trump administration. This was far-right politicians who have been leveraging this exact blueprint for months and years, which is to conflate any criticisms of the Israeli government and any advocacy of Palestinian rights with discrimination against Jewish students. The most egregious example I think that we've seen to date is the ransom letter to Columbia University, which is effectively demanding that they suppress all Palestine solidarity activities, that they completely change their curriculum, that they put specific programs into receivership, otherwise jeopardizing their federal funding. These efforts are never really about protecting marginalized students or protecting Jewish students who have actually been disproportionately participating and speaking out against the Israeli government's war crimes against Palestinians. It's always really been about weaponizing our civil rights laws, weaponizing our education laws, to limit dissent and to establish the precedent that speech is only acceptable if it is not politically inconvenient. And so when we talk about how we got here, it's important to understand that this weaponization has been part of a decade-long drift, and I would argue this is bipartisan, towards the undermining of academia at the federal and at the state level, frankly, by treating higher education as a battleground for these culture wars, to limit the role of faculty on campus, to limit how academia actually functions in American higher education. And this has largely been led by donors and by politicians who have seen colleges and universities as incubators of progressive and liberal ideologies and classified that as somehow anti-American. And so when we talk about what's happening today, I think it's important to understand what these ideas and what this pressure has been rooted in. But to be clear, the expansion of this weaponization has been formalized under the Trump administration through new federal regulations that will attempt to codify more aggressive weaponization and conditions of federal funding. I think we've already seen announcements for rulemaking processes to amend programs like the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. There was an executive order on this very idea, which essentially was to say that people can still access the relief under public service loan forgiveness, but for certain nonprofit organizations, their employees won't be eligible if that organization works on anything related to Palestinian rights, if they work on anything related to gender equity or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's really concerning because now they're starting to draw lines on issues that they want to politicize. And to be clear, this always has started with Palestine. It has been the easiest way for far-right extremists to be able to break through the cracks of the foundation of academia, but it is very clear that the same tactics, the same blueprints are going to continue to be used on other issues that conservative extremists disagree with on political reasons. We will very likely also see regulatory attempts to actually regulate the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into the law, which would conflate anti-Zionism and criticisms of the Israeli government with discrimination. We're also, as I mentioned, we're seeing limitations on the role that the Department of Education can play by significantly cutting its staffing, a clear violation of the law, something that we're continuing to see lawsuits challenge those reductions in force, but it is undermining the department's critical missions, including its ability to actually be a civil rights agency. And then this administration is now trying to leverage that consolidated power to be a weapon against colleges and universities. We're seeing broad executive orders and broad executive actions to criminalize or defund any sort of campuses that allow activism that this administration is considering anti-American. As Asli had said, like there is the accreditation executive order that just came out yesterday. There have been numerous executive orders attacking colleges and universities for extreme leftist ideas. They have continuously classified any speech on Palestinian rights as somehow anti-American, which is very dangerous. We're continuing to see a lack of due process for colleges and universities, and colleges and universities failing to actually challenge these actions that are blatantly illegal and undermining the actual laws that apply to them, raises more concerns about whether there's ever actually going to be anyone out there protecting academia. As Asli said, the fact that there are people who are starting to challenge, whether it's Harvard, whether it's the AAUP or other entities, these are the types of challenges that we need to see progress in order for higher education to maintain its foundational principles of academic freedom. We're seeing obvious attacks on curriculum and limitations to curriculum through letters that are being sent to colleges and universities. These investigations that the Department of Education is quote unquote doing. I think they've now announced investigations across over 100 campuses for either anything related to Palestine activism or anything related to diversity and equity and inclusion programs. And we're also seeing increased targeting of faculty through Title VI and Title IX investigations. This again has started with Palestine, but we're starting to see expansions of that around like quote unquote hostile environments. And we're seeing preemptive institutional compliance, again, as Asli had mentioned, because of this fear of losing federal funding, the voluntary restriction of speech on Palestine, the disbanding of student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, in attempts to capitulate to the government. But what we have seen in the past, when you look at the global patterns of authoritarian regimes, they always attack academia first in order to consolidate that power, in order to limit that free thought and expression of different ideas. And that's exactly what the Trump administration is doing today. So when we talk about campus repression, it's not just about these overzealous administrators. It's not just about, creating space for students. It's about what politicians are doing to try and coordinate strategies to repurpose our laws of civil rights and education policy for tools of ideological policing. If we don't stop that through legal challenges, through organizing, through advocacy, by holding our campuses accountable and making sure that they stand up for themselves, the consequences are going to reverberate far beyond the classroom. They're going to reverberate throughout our democracy, and that's something that we can't allow.
Thank you very much for that, Tariq. I want to turn now to Lara Friedman, the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, to talk to us about some of the additional repressive efforts that we're seeing, not just from the White House, but also what's going on with Congress and what's going on with other lawfare efforts as well. Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yousef. Thank you for organizing this conversation today. And I'm going to try to be really brief. I think actually Asli and Tariq covered so much, and what they covered obviously goes beyond the campus. These are broader trends. I will say that, some of this is just sort of maddening. And Yousef, you and I have worked together on this for years. We've talked about this for years, and we've been telling people for years, right? And notice what's going on and realize that this is about the bigger issues at stake in democracy. One of my lines that I've used for years is, you may not care about Israel-Palestine, you should, but you may not. But you also should, because Israel-Palestine cares about you, and it's coming for your civil liberties. It's coming for your rights. This is that issue. And this isn't, as Asli laid out brilliantly, this isn't new. This didn't start with Trump. The groundwork for this was laid in the past decade or more. And while everyone's focus right now is on the campus, because that's sort of where, the tip of the spear is going through the campuses now, right? That's where people see, maybe are starting to understand what's at stake. We've seen this going on for years. And I think two things that people may have some awareness of that really exemplify this is the anti-BDS legislation that's spread over the past decade across the country. And this is legislation which is ostensibly about stopping the horrible anti-Semitic, anti-Israel policies of people boycotting settlements or Israel. As Tariq said, the tool of government is money. So we have legislation that basically says, if you will not agree to give up your First Amendment right to oppose Israel or settlements by boycotting, you cannot have contracts or you cannot have state investment. But what these laws really say, and we saw this actually resolved by the Eighth Circuit in Arkansas case is they're basically saying you don't have a right to boycott anything. This isn't just about whether you're allowed to boycott Israel or settlements. They're basically saying, and the Eighth Circuit said that while everyone thought the right to boycott was a resolved thing by the Supreme Court, you have a right to boycott, it's free speech. The Eighth Circuit said no, you have a right to the expressive part of boycotts. You can talk about them, you can call for them, you can say you support them, but the actual act of boycotting is not expressive free speech. It is commercial, financial action, and therefore it's not supported. It's not protected. So in the name of protecting Israel, a foreign country, from Americans expressing their objection to its policies, we have now set a precedent, which I suspect will be used more broadly under the Trump administration. This happened some years back. We set a precedent that actually boycotting anything is not protected free speech. In parallel to these anti-boycott laws that spread across the country and that were widely bipartisan, because as soon as you mention Israel and anti-Semitism, you basically, and this is the key to everything that's happening right now, at best you completely, or at worst you neutralize what would normally be progressive opposition to initiatives that clearly run counter to the progressive basic ideals of democracy. At best, so at worst you neutralize them, and at best you bring them on board. And what we've seen across the country with these BDS laws and what we're going to talk about, these anti-Semitism laws, which Tariq mentioned, this is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is the definition of anti-Semitism, which in its definitional part is poorly written and doesn't add any value. The only part that adds value, and it adds value for people with a specific goal in mind, are the examples that are attached to it, which are generally adopted as part of the definition. And these examples, the majority of them conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and they've been weaponized as such. And we've seen over the past decade an effort to pass this or adopt it into law, even though it's called the legally non-binding. Literally, the words legally non-binding are part of it. It has been adopted into law or adopted by proclamation across the US in an increasing number of states. It was adopted by Trump as part of Title VI in his first administration, which was never, of all the executive orders that Biden saw fit to rescind, he did not rescind that one. And so you have this already going on long before this administration, where you effectively are saying, for the sake of shutting down criticism of Israel and protest of Israel or settlements, we are going to redefine free speech. We're going to redefine what it means to rights to protest, and fundamentally reimagine U.S. democracy to create what is a broad Israel exception. We usually talk about a Palestine exception to free speech. This is an Israel exception to U.S. democracy across the board. That lays the groundwork for where we are today on campus. It lays the groundwork for what we haven't talked about, which are lawsuits. We're seeing lawsuits that have been emerging. Even it was started in the Biden era. It's continuing in the Trump era. These are lawsuits against students. They're lawsuits against organizers. They're lawsuits against organizations. Some of these are claiming, support for terror. They're claiming violation of civil rights. I mean, this largely falls into the category of slap suits. These are lawsuits just aimed at making people miserable. And the people who bring these lawsuits, frankly, they win either way, right? If they win, they have a precedential determination by a court, which makes people who they disagree with, it chills their speech. And if they lose, they've still caused the person they're suing or the organization they're suing enough misery that it will chill free speech, they hope. And that's something that is expanding right now in the Trump era. On top of that, though, we have this basic, if you look at the moment we're in, and it was really clear where this was headed in the last year of the Biden era, what we saw on Capitol Hill with these witch hunt kangaroo court hearings where they dragged in, people from universities and essentially made them swear fealty to Congress, to Israel, to illiberal views, as a way to say, no, we're not anti-Semites. We have a confluence right now between two trends that have been very strong in this country and have been growing in strength for at least the past 2 decades. One of those is the trend of pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian, sort of zero-sum thinking. And I would argue, and I have argued, and I'm arguing here, that was really unleashed in the wake of the Oslo Accords. There were those who really hated the peace process, who were forced to adapt to it for a few years. And after the Second Intifada, they said, we're done, gloves are off, and now this is full on zero sum on the Israel side as a foreign policy issue. And Israel is pursuing it that way, which makes, frankly, Israel a lot harder to defend in the public square when you can no longer say, but it wants to make peace. And as you said, as we get to a point where Israel is not defensible in the public square, the shift to tactics really returned to what it was before Madrid, before Oslo, when the word Palestine in the US discourse was absolutely equated with terrorism, when there, the whole idea of Palestinian rights or Palestinian states was just beyond the pale. And it was an effort to return to that. So we've been seeing that since the early aughts on steroids. In parallel, we've had this growing illiberalism, which I think a lot of progressives were largely unaware of. Most Americans who are not part of this trend that brought us the Tea Party and then brought us the Trump administration, I think we're unaware of this trend in American politics, which is increased, which is very, it is nativist, it is anti-immigrant, it is xenophobic, it is illiberal socially, and it seeks to play upon what I would almost call sort of these red meat issues for some parts of America, whether it's LGBTQ or it's immigrants, or increasingly we saw with the Tea Party, it is the emergence of the Tea Party, it is the philo-Semitism, right? The Christian Zionism. And it wove the philo-Semitism, Christian Zionism piece of it into the DNA of what has become the emboldened and now in power illiberal movement in the US. And you see these two strands, right? The zero sum, shut down all criticism of Israel is the only way to be pro-Israel, and the increasingly philo-Semitic, Christian Zionist, nativist, illiberal trends. And we saw this on display every day in the last year, well, certainly since October 7th. It's been on display every day. And where we are today, we're seeing this. Yes, universities are clearly the starting point. I mean, the largest push for this. Why? Because obviously, this has been, I actually pulled up an article, Yousef, while you were doing your introduction, I pulled up an article from Yediot Aharonot, Ynet, which came out in November of 2023, I believe, maybe of 2024. It was basically an article about the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and their plan to shut down criticism of Israel on campuses, and lays out essentially a set of objectives, which is actually the policy of the US today. How do we stop criticism? How do we stop protest? We go to campuses. And who hates campuses, in addition to people who don't want criticism of Israel, is the illiberal right. If anyone paid attention to the hearings last year, and the one we're going to have next week, we're 2 weeks on the Hill, the hearings last year where they brought in the members of Congress, were berating the university presidents. 90% of what they were berating them about had no pretense of being about Palestine or Israel or Jewish safety. It was berating them about liberal education. It was berating them about DEI. It was berating them about, weren't they afraid of upsetting God? I mean, people really should watch those hearings. It's quite extraordinary. So we have the universities. We have NGOs. All of us who work in the NGO space, I run a foundation, have spent the past week just waiting. When is the next executive order coming out? Because it's clear this administration is trying to figure out a way to come after the entire civil society space. Anybody, they basically went after the law firms, that's done. They went after universities, and that's largely done. And by the way, let's be clear, Harvard is standing up, but if you read Harvard's filing, Harvard's lawsuit basically says, we've already given you everything you want in shutting down free speech on Palestine. That's their main defense. We've done what you want. You shouldn't be coming after us anymore, which is not the same really as defending free speech and protest. But so we've come after that. And the next space really seems to be, after all of this, is going to be civil society. And that is the organizations on the ground that work for human rights, civil rights, protection of vulnerable populations, and including those who work in the space for Israel-Palestine. And the last thing I'll say, and just to mention it because I don't want to go into great detail, I want to mention Project Esther. So anybody listening to me who doesn't know me, doesn't want to believe me, fine. Go to the Heritage Foundation website and look up Project Esther. And this is the same people who brought you Project 2025 have brought you Project Esther. And this came out shortly before the Trump election, the last election that brought him to power. And this is effectively on paper. We've told you what we're going to do. It's always baffling to me. People tell you what they're going to do, but then you disagree that this is their intent. They're telling you their intent. We are going to shut down all criticism related to Israel, all protest, by calling all of it anti-Semitic and support for terror. This has been the playbook all along. The protests around October 7th have now given license for this to be the official policy. If you dare speak out in support of Palestinian lives, Palestinian rights, doesn't matter if you're Jewish, anything else, you are either an anti-Semite or a supporter of terror or both. And that's what this plan is about. And that's what they're saying they're going to do. People should read it and take it seriously.
Thank you very much for all of that, Lara. I want to turn now to Abed Ayoub from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee to talk to us about the role of immigration law in all of this. But before we do, I just want to remind folks that you can submit your questions, and we'll get to questions after introductory remarks through the Q&A feature here on Zoom or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And with that, Abed, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yousef, and I appreciate the invite. And it's always great to, reconnect and discuss these issues with this panel and the great folks on this session. So thank you all. Look, and I appreciate all the comments that have been made already, and it's covered a great deal of what's going on. The immigration part of this is very important. And we are seeing the weaponization of immigration. We're seeing immigration law and policy and procedure used as a tool to silence our community, to go after our community members. But it's also important to keep in mind a couple things that I'll go over, right? It's not only our community right now that's under attack on the immigration front. This is all connected and all part of an agenda, a very anti-immigrant agenda that we're seeing play out. And we have been here before. So kind of in a full circle moment, I remember moving to DC back in 2007 or 8 and working with Yousef over at ADC when he was my colleague. And around that time, I believe, he came up to me to tell me about this Operation Boulder project that, happened in the 70s. And we went ahead and filed FOIA documents and got a bunch of responses on this thing. They've been sitting on a desk in binders for like a decade. Not, when were we going to use this, right? And I thought it would be kind of like a historical archival type of thing. But let me tell you a little bit of Operation Boulder and how it relates now. Essentially, Operation Boulder laid the blueprint for what we're seeing play out. And for those that are not familiar, Operation Boulder was a program implemented by Nixon shortly after the Munich Games in '72. And in short terms, what Operation Boulder said, hey, go after go after Arab students that are in the U.S. or any students that are showing support for Palestine or pro-Palestinian students. And we began seeing raids, we began seeing cancellation of visas, increased scrutiny when applying for visas. Folks disappeared, and that's when actually we raised the alarms when prior to Mahmoud Khalil's arrest. Our concern was, hey, during Operation Boulder, one of the things the government did was intentionally detain, abduct Arab nationals, and friends and family wouldn't hear from them for months. They had no idea where they went. And you got to put yourself at a time in the 70s, no internet, no WhatsApp, no, cell phones. So if you're an international student here in the US, you were picked up, you're abducted, all of a sudden, no one hears from you for 6-7 months until you're sent back home, whether that be, Syria, Algeria, Palestine, Lebanon. That's how it kind of played out. And that's what we're seeing also play out now, where, when Mahmoud was detained, he was moved from facility to facility intentionally. So the family doesn't hear from him. He can't get in touch with a lawyer. We don't know where he is. There's that fear factor they're trying to drive. But Operation Boulder did lay the groundwork in targeting Arab students or students that are showing support for Palestine, and the immigration code, the immigration sections used for Operation Boulder were also used by other presidents, right? And the blanket cancellations of visas. We saw President Carter did this with Iranians in '79. The targeting of other visa holders, as we saw with the prior Trump administration, and as well as like the Clinton administration and others. So using immigration to silence us, to target our community has always been a tool. What we're seeing now, as I said earlier, the way this is connected to the broader immigration movement is important to understand. When this administration, one of their one of their underlying key objectives is birthright citizenship. So going into this initial, first 100 days, from what we heard, from what their position is, we can go after, supporters of Palestine, Arab students, Palestinian students, or those that support them, because none of the Democrats or not many on the left are going to stand up and say what you're doing is wrong. So they want to lay the groundwork, lay the precedent that, you know what, the president has the authority to determine who can stay, who can go. And one of their main objectives in this first 100 days, and it's played out, and we don't know it's played out till I tell you, they've weakened the value of the green card. This is intentional. And anyone knows, like a year ago, if you say, okay, I got a green card, or my uncle got a green card, you're comfortable, you're here, you're in the US. That green card was kind of like the ticket for you to live here and carry on with your life. Now people with the green card are worried, they're afraid. So they've already laid the precedent and let the public know, hey, we can go after a green card. So what's the next step after the green card? Once they've convinced the public they can do this, will probably be birthright citizenship. That's the next line of attack. But they did use this moment to um, go after green card holders, let the American public believe they have the authority to do this, let them know they have reason to do this, and then try to notch a couple legal victories in the courts here or there when they can. And the amount of cases that we're seeing coming and going it's insane. There's cases filed every day. They're winning some, they're losing many, but they're going to continue doing that. The one thing they did not expect or did not anticipate is just how much Americans value their First Amendment. And that's the one thing that we are seeing coming from left, right, across the board. We're starting to see more and more people frame this in a First Amendment issue. And if that's the way they're looking at it, fine, just push back against what we're seeing. But this practice of using immigration, using the immigration policies, going after the green card holders, the student visa holders, it's going to continue. Do they have the authority? Do they have the authority to do this? My answer is it doesn't matter whether or not they have the authority with this administration. It really doesn't matter. They're moving forward with it anyway. We've seen this happen with the plane that went to El Salvador when it shouldn't have, and some of the removal cases we're seeing, and some of the way legal permanent residents or even U.S. citizens are getting emails to turn themselves in. Facts, procedure, policies, practices, it doesn't matter anymore. And that's what makes this moment very scary, is we don't know what the next move is. We don't know even if there will be a next move. Maybe they just stop and, move on to the next thing in a few months. But we do have to be prepared, particularly on the immigration front. We're going to see more and more of these individual cases. Asli, I think at the beginning said 1,800. It's kind of like the presumed, number. I've seen that floating around, 1,500, 1,800, 2,000 or so visas canceled. And remember, we don't, Arab nationals don't make up a big part of student visa holders in the US. Most of them are coming from other parts of the world, China, India, Pakistan. All these countries have more presence here than we do. So we're going to see the impact is going to go beyond just the Arab or Muslim community directly. But it is going to continue, and they are going to test the boundaries, test the limits to see what they can get away with on the immigration front. So a lot of the advice we're giving, a lot of the folks we're talking to, we're advising, for example, students, make sure that you are in compliance, make sure that you're not below full time, that you are enrolled, doing what you need to do, and don't get in trouble. Use common sense. If you have, we're seeing students put in removal or have their stats taken away for unpaid traffic tickets, or for a moving violation, or for something so small and minimal that it should be taken care of easily. And it's also important to keep in mind that on this immigration front, again, some of these reasons have been used by prior administrations. Now we're just seeing it used against students. We have had, doesn't matter who's in office, again, a couple DUIs or unpaid tickets, or someone was targeted for specific reasons. We've seen this before. So that part of immigration is there. That's the part of the system that is troubling. It's broken. That's what they used to go after. But to see it at this scale is again, it's problematic. It's scary. The other component is the limits, Rubio and State Department, what they're doing with the cancellation of the visas while people are here. That adds like another layer to things where, you have State Department now acting on their own, canceling these visas, sometimes not communicating with USAS or not communicating with DHS on what's happening. That's creating confusion. And we're going to see more and more of that happen. So, just in short, to wrap up, look, we have been here before. We've seen these types of practices before. I would recommend, to read about Operation Boulder, read how that played out and ultimately how that wrapped up. But and also important to keep in mind, just like Operation Boulder and Sears the same way, even after the programs wrap up, you're looking at 5, 10 years later, we still saw fallout from those programs. So even if this administration wraps up whatever they're calling this operation in 2025, we could be in 2030, 2032, where you're hearing of somebody or a few group of students or nationals here in the US fighting to stay here because of a program from 6 or 7 years ago. So no way does the ending of the enforcement of aspect of this bring an end to the impact this is going to have on the community. And we have to be prepared for that and offer the support for that. And last, do keep in mind the broader immigration fight and the broader attack on, different immigrant communities that's happening in this moment and how we're really all connected in this fight together. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Abed. I want to turn to some questions now, and there are so many. We could be talking about this for much longer than we have, but I want to focus on a couple of things for each of you, and maybe we start with Asla first. One thing I'm wondering is, I mean, have we ever seen anything like this elsewhere in the history of the academy? Basically, efforts to use anti-discrimination law to police what could be said or taught about a particular country. I mean, is there any other country that that language education is policed around or has been policed around so significantly as is in this case with Israel?
Yeah, so I think as several of my dear co-panelists, including Tariq, mentioned, this is a classic authoritarian playbook in the generic sense, going after universities, doing so as part of a top-down ideological cultural revolution to remake the shape of elites in the country, to remake the orientation of knowledge production, to basically take some topics off the agenda, place other ones on the agenda, to undermine underlying commitments to, constitutionalism, basically, right? So here, the value of diversity is a product, or understandings of the value of diversity in the academy are an extension of the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. This is a full-scale war seeking to dismantle all of those achievements. So in that sense, there are similarities. And there are also many authoritarian countries that basically deem particular topics verboten, oftentimes related to their own policies. If today you were to speak in favor of Ukraine and Russia, you would face criminal sentencing. If in Turkey you were to make claims about the Armenian genocide, you would likely feel very, very serious censure, if not direct prosecution. And so this falls in line with that. When you can't, and I think Lara really made this point, when you cannot win the sort of war for ideas, when you've lost the capacity to morally persuade the case for your policies, then the next resort is to go to full-on coercion. If you're not going to be able to compel, and I mean, this has been a problem, I think, for supporters of Israeli policies against Palestinians for some time, basically from the end of the 1990s, from the time that it became apparent that the so-called Oslo peace process was not going to deliver either peace or justice for Palestinians, and that it was in fact cover for the expansion of Israeli settlement practices, annexationist goals, etc., the moral argument began to be lost. And at that moment, with the Hill, with both parties and all presidential administrations fully committed to the support of Israeli policies, whatever they might be, the challenge was to shift attention for those who wanted to support Israel's policies and practices to civil society. So there has been a war on NGOs, a war on universities that began in the aughts, again, as Lara already pointed out, with new organizations like Campus Watch or NGO Monitor or UN Monitor, et cetera, emerging in that era to basically coercively demand speech restrictions be imposed in the civil society sector where the argument was not won and where ground was being lost. It's also important to note that the ground that was being lost was amongst American Jews as much as anything else in the United States, and particularly younger generations who did not grow up in the aftermath of 1967 imagining Israel as a kind of conquering little Sparta that was fighting a war, existential wars. I mean, however, one might criticize that framing of 67. Generations that emerged well after that, when Israel had established itself as a regional hegemon, the only nuclear power in the region, and increasingly the biggest bully in its neighborhood, they had greater and greater difficulty reconciling their liberal commitments at home in the domestic context with defense of what was increasingly a deeply authoritarian and violent actor in a region that they did not have direct ties to. And that problem was a real conundrum for those who wanted to support Israel and see support for it continue to be maintained and grow in the American Jewish community. And so that's really, I think, the origin story. But it is a kind of playbook we see elsewhere, wherever authoritarian actors feel the need to coercively police speech because they're unable to persuade, they resort to these kinds of tactics. And if they're able to seize the levers of the state, then they use the levers of the state to make sure that they can engage in this kind of censorship.
Thanks for that, Asli. I want to turn now to Tariq with a question. Lara talked about a couple of different trends that were kind of coming together to help produce the situation we are seeing. Now, I wanted to ask you about a different one, though, that I'm not sure gets talked about enough, specifically as it relates to where universities are today with all of this stuff. How much of what we're seeing today, in terms of university behavior, is also a product of how the university itself has evolved over time, becoming more like a corporation, for example, than a school, with so much of the power in universities moving from where it was historically among the faculty to the very top with administrators who are really controlling more power than they have in the past, and focused more on the bottom line, the endowments, the donors, and so much. How much of what we're seeing today is also a product of changing university culture?
I think that's a huge component of this. I mean, so higher education historically has really operated under this model of what's known as shared governance, where faculty are leading part of the decision-making process, but they are not the only ones. It's not just the college president, it's not just the board. They all work in conjunction with one another to make decisions on behalf of the university. Over decades, we've seen a diminishing role of faculty. We've seen attacks on tenure. We've seen attacks on what faculty are doing, and a growing role for what's known as like the administration. So you see more administrators, more bureaucrats working within the institution to help advise students. That was historically a role of faculty. To like the role of faculty became a little bit more about research and teaching and less about all of the other functions when, dating back to, the very early days of academia and American higher education, faculty played all of those roles and functions. And so as we've seen this corporatization of higher education, we've also seen a increase in not just the role of those other entities, but also a heavier reliance on resources. We've seen the cost of education increase tremendously, and not because of tenure, not because of the cost that it takes to have and retain faculty, but because we've seen other things expand over time. We've seen less investments from state governments, which often indicate that you need to rely more on federal resources, which have largely been based through Title IV and federal student loans. And so now students have to also invest more money into their own educations. That creates a really cyclical effect on who actually can control decision making. And as you have boards that are trying to make sure that they are prioritizing whatever the needs are of the institution, they are focused on long-term sustainability. They are focused on resources, and that allows for opportunities to influence, how you prioritize education, what programs you focus on. You don't see people as much often gravitating towards, linguistic programs. You don't see people gravitating towards humanitarian or humanities issues and history because it is less profitable for students and therefore it's also less profitable for the school. So how are we identifying those opportunities? How does that actually undermine the independence of academia? And when you also add into the fact that because faculty are playing a smaller role, because administrators are playing a bigger role, they believe their role is more important to the future of academia. And, why should faculty have tenure? Why should faculty be able to stay here longer than us? Let's actually undermine the role of tenure, the role of academic freedom. We can make these decisions too. And now you're hiring more adjunct faculty who have less influence in that process. And so when you limit that influence, when you limit the role of that shared governance model, and you simultaneously make money a bigger focus in the goals of the institution, and this is all to say, like, this is really how we're seeing the most elite institutions of higher education. So I don't want this to say, like, broadly, this is how all higher education in America functions, but it has been a shift over the last decade, and that actually does undermine institutions' abilities to withstand some of these political and financial pressures.
Thanks very much for that, Tara. I want to ask Lara now a question. We talked about the Red Scares, and I think Asla very appropriately put this current moment into context as being, the scope of it, especially as it relates to the attack on higher education being much more dangerous than what we saw historically. But I wanted to ask you, on this issue first. With the first Red Scare, with the second Red Scare, with Japanese internment. I mean, these are all historical moments that don't age well. Like, we look back on these things with shame, right? About the way that society reacted, the way that our government reacted. It's really not a good look, right? And the second thing is, in the first and second Red Scare, especially, a lot of the people that were targeted were Jewish Americans. I would say disproportionately so, and anti-Semitism certainly played a role in that. And this, of course, led, among other things, to the really strong role that Jewish American organizations have played over time in supporting principles of civil rights and civil liberties. And I wanted to ask you, sort of, given that history, how you evaluate where the groups that have historically played such an important role within the Jewish American establishment are on these issues that we are seeing today.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I find myself thinking about a meme that I saw on social media a couple months ago, which said something like, if you ever wondered what you would have been doing during, I don't know, the slavery or the Holocaust or the Red Scare, look at what you're doing now. Now you know. I mean, it's easy to say that these things don't age well, and all of us like to imagine ourselves as being the heroes in previous eras of illiberalism and authoritarianism, and we would have stood up for the underdog. It's getting tested right now, and I think people are seeing, I've not joked. I always thought, as a Jewish American, when I was taught about the Holocaust and never again, clearly meant never again for anyone, and I understood that through the lens of people like Hannah Arendt, and the idea that it is this banality of evil isn't to say that there aren't people who are genuinely evil, but it's to say that the evil that we were dealing with there fundamentally was something that is present in everyone by choosing to not act. That is what enables it. And that's why always remembering the Holocaust was sort of the byword of subsequent generations, not because you can't let this just happen to us again, the Jews, but because this could happen anywhere. Any of us could be part of it. And looking at this current moment, that feels especially acute, especially now that we're seeing defenders of Israel say, don't exploit the never again. We never meant it for anyone except for us, which is just pretty shocking. In terms of how the organizational world, the Jewish legacy organizational world is reacting, I think you have to distinguish between sort of the new generation of Jewish engagement and activism, much of which is not in Jewish organizations. And that's something that I think is difficult for people to understand. They think of, if not now, and JVP, awesomeness, that's great. There's an entire generation, though, of Jewish Americans who are active in organizations that are not organized around Jewish identity, because their identity is as Americans and progressives and as human beings, and they are Jewish in that space, which in this era, post October 7th, includes many, many spaces that are defined first and foremost around defending the humanity, the rights, and the lives of Palestinians. So you have to distinguish between that and Jewish legacy organizations, which were organized at least in principle, around the never again and fighting illiberalism and authoritarianism. Where those legacy Jewish organizations today is fascinating to watch. We've seen since Trump came in, and during the Biden era, you saw groups like the Anti-Defamation League not only supporting the crackdown, but really demanding it. Calling for students to be investigated by the FBI, raising allegations that there are ties to terror by students on campus who are protesting for their lives. They must be somehow connected directly to Hamas. It was quite extraordinary and appalling to see. American Jewish Committee, which has been on the front end of trying to weaponize and enforce the IRA definition. The broader federation system. What you've seen, though, since Trump came in and we started seeing the catch and deport policy of with students and with immigrants that aren't even related to Israel Palestine, you saw some interesting sort of hints at trying to create some distance. Right. And I'd say it's largely not credible when people like Deborah Lipstadt on the one hand say, well, I'm not entirely comfortable with what they're doing, but really they just need to do it better. I think she used the word deftly in an interview. They need to do it more deftly. Mr. Greenblatt from the ADL has been on a media tour for the past few days, basically praising the Trump administration for leaning in on the cracking down on campuses and expressing a little concern about students not getting due process, but making clear that he considers all these students Hamasniks, he used that word, which suggests that they are terrorists who don't deserve due process. So you see this sort of, we don't want to be blamed for it, but we also do want credit, and we approve kind of thing. But then you also see, well, over the weekend, there was a great piece written, it was published on Substack by a guy named Ron Campius, who used to write for the JTA, about what is a fascinating schism that is developing in the Jewish Federation world between the federations and the JCPA, which is another national Jewish body, where effectively there was a letter expressing some concern, not an outright pro-Palestine, blah, blah, blah letter, but a letter expressing some concern from a Jewish perspective about these authoritarian tactics. And that catalyzed a letter from the head of the Jewish Federation of North America, basically telling people not to sign it. And I mean, people should read the article for themselves. And since his letter came out, my understanding is additional people have signed on to that first letter expressing concern. So you're seeing kind of a push-pull. The bottom line part of it for me, and I see this in discussions in the Jewish organizational world a lot, is there's a lot of focus on how these Trump policies are affecting Jews. And, if you take money away from Harvard, you hurt Jewish students, you hurt Jewish researchers, you hurt Jewish safety. And that is all true. If the idea is, if the Trump administration could find a way to craft authoritarian policies in a way that made sure that every Jewish parochial interest in this country was protected, that somehow that would then be okay, that is not okay. I would argue with the vast majority of Jewish Americans who do care about civil rights, who do care about free speech, who even are willing to defend free speech that they're uncomfortable with. As a general principle, going back to what I was raised with on Jewish Americans and supporting the ACLU and the right of Nazis to march in Skokie. I mean, this is part of like the DNA of the Jewish progressive community, which still represents, people will argue that more Jewish Americans are voting for Trump. I still think it's like 85% of the community that didn't vote for him. And by the way, Mr. Trump, when you didn't vote for him, that somehow, if you listen to Bannon, that somehow means that we're disloyal, or we're disloyal to our actual Prime Minister, Bibi. That's again the philo-Semitism piece of it. So you have philo-Semitism and MAGA. That is not the overwhelming Jewish American community. That all being said, and I wrote about this at the end of the last Trump administration, there is unquestionably a subcurrent. It is the zeitgeist in Israel since the first Trump era, and it is a subcurrent in the Jewish American community that somehow has decided that this time around, authoritarian and illiberalism is going to be good for the Jews. And that is anti-Semitic and anti-Israel to not support it. And for anyone who has any understanding of history, this is such a betrayal of Jewish experience and of Jewish history and of Jewish learning and of the fundamental values that we, at least as Jewish Americans, are taught, that it is almost beyond belief.
Thank you for that, Laura. Abed, I want to ask you, you talked about birthright citizenship sort of being in the crosshairs of this administration. The president has, made no bones about that. He's been very clear in the past that this is something that's on the agenda. Denaturalization is sort of the logical next step after targeting green card holders. And I know you said that this administration doesn't really care about what they're allowed to do versus not allowed to do. They're going to try to do it anyway. But I wonder if you could kind of briefly talk us through what sort of legal constraints there are on the administration when it comes to attempts at denaturalization versus sort of attempts to try to revoke the green cards of Americans or visas of Americans.
Sure.
Of immigrants.
Sure. So look, revoking a green card is it's an easier process for the U.S. government to do so. The denaturalization process is a lot harder. However, they will go as far as the amount of resources they want to put into something. Prior administrations, we've had cases of denaturalization, not many. Usually they'll involve, if somebody obtained their citizenship through fraud or they lied or there's some underlying factor component where the government has something to move on to denaturalize. Now, what we may see happen here is this underlying fact might be something so minute or something so immaterial to the citizenship application, but are they going to be able to get away with it? For example, if somebody they didn't put their full name or they missed their middle name on an application, right? Something along those lines. Is that going to be reason enough for a court to allow for denaturalization? This is in what if they have the judges that they've appointed, if they've stacked the courts in their favor, we may see that happen. And remember, the denaturalization cases also should go through the Department of Justice. From what we've learned, there's already been a task force put together by the administration that is looking at denaturalizations. And that's headed by DHS, and we could see the first actions taken sometime in May. So they are going to move quickly on this. How far they go, how fast they go, again, it's going to depend on the number of resources they want to put behind it. But our concern is they are going to go after any fact or any item that could just open the door a little bit for them to bring a case. While in the past administrations, you had to have something really concrete, because going after a citizenship is an extreme step. It's a long process. It's a complicated process. How invested is this administration going to be in clogging up a whole, the courts, the systems, in going through something like this? So again, revoking a green card, quick, they can do it. Going after denaturalization is a different story. But that's the next step. And then after that, you're looking at like the birthright citizenship component.
Thank you, Abed, for breaking that down for us. We have a number of questions in the Q&A feature here on Zoom. Also, I was wondering if maybe you could take the first one here. What is the best case scenario for the legal cases, the AAUP and MESA case against the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, the best case scenario is that we get an injunction to prevent the administration from continuing its ideological deportation policy. So that's our goal. And then eventually we prevail and show that that policy is in contravention of the First Amendment and unconstitutional and therefore enjoined. But the reality is it's very hard to know whether that's going to be the outcome in that case. We had the first argument just yesterday, and we will know more as the case unfolds. There are, of course, numerous legal challenges underway now to the Trump administration's actions, including, as I've said, other legal action led by the AAUP and other actors. Individual universities are beginning to act, coalitions of students that are being threatened by deportation, et cetera. But what Abed said is true. They are going to try everything, and they're throwing everything conceivable at the wall. And if 2% of what they're attempting succeeds, because there are limited resources to challenge the blatant illegality of all of these actions, we will face a very serious constitutional crisis just over that 2%, let alone if more is able to succeed than that. So what is needed now is organizing at every level, exactly as you described in the title of this event, from campuses to the streets to the courtrooms. We have to organize. This is a full frontal assault on civil society across the board. There has to be sectoral unity, whether it's in higher education, whether it's in the philanthropies, whether it's in the NGO sector, whether it's in law firms. I mean, for example, it would be incredible to see a law firm taking the kind of stance that Harvard did. As Lara said, it's far too little. Harvard's defense is far from being a full-throated defense of academic freedom or the integrity of higher education, but it is a line being drawn. And it would be great to see, for example, the law firms who have now committed pro bono funds to right-wing causes as part of their capitulation to the Trump administration, when they're directed to now use those pro bono funds to defend unconstitutional action, to say no further, and to draw the line and to see if we can see some kind of retreat in that sector as well from the full, capitulation to the Trump administration's authoritarian action. So we can't rely on lawsuits alone. We need far broader organizing than that. But the best case scenario for the lawsuit we've brought is to at least put the brakes on the most egregious violations and the most egregious weaponization of both anti-discrimination law and immigration law in this moment against the colleagues and students in our community that are now being targeted by the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think one of the really striking things that we've seen from this administration, among many unprecedented things, has been the sort of blitz that they have carried out against law firms, really trying to kind of intimidate and tame an entire sector that I don't think we've ever seen before in American history. And that's, I don't think that's happening by accident, right? I want to turn now to Tariq. We have another question here in the chat. How do we explain the intensive and brutal tactics that on U.S. universities that we haven't seen since McCarthyism against, student protesters when, we had anti-war protests in the 1960s that were much more militant and disruptive, but we didn't see the kind of repressive measures against students and universities then that we are seeing now. Tara, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and I can keep this short. It's money. It comes down to money. In the 60s, I think the average cost of tuition and fees was around $250 for an academic year. If you adjust that for inflation, that's still less than $5,000 in today's money. That's 2, 3, 4 times cheaper than what college is today on a public college campus. So when you talk about the leverage that the government has today that it didn't have in the 60s when it was, weaponizing in a much, much more aggressive way, the reason that the impact is so much more severe is frankly just the much more powerful leverage that money has today across academia.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, Tara. I mean, there was plenty of repression targeting activism in the 60s and in the 70s, the anti-war movement. There was the, entire, COINTELPRO scheme, the attacks on the New Left, the attacks on Black nationalists, the infiltration of civil rights organizations. I mean, you name it. And a lot of this stuff was happening on campuses, even if not necessarily targeting campus administrators themselves in the way that we are seeing today. Abed, maybe you want to take this last one, or anyone else that might be familiar with it. Yesterday, it just happens that we saw around the University of Michigan what seemed to be federal agents breaking into the homes of activists, Palestine-related activists. What do we know about what happened here, and what this was all about?
Look, so we're still getting the information. It's important to note that the state attorney general was also involved in this. So it was a state action, from our understanding, by Dana Nessel, who's a elected official in Michigan, Democrat, has good relationships with the community that kind of pushed this raid forward and this ongoing attack on students. They're tying this into some acts of vandalism that had happened earlier in the year, but the students were not charged or anything. And what's concerning is the FBI, from what I'm reading or understanding, is the FBI was called in for backup, which doesn't make any sense. This is an extreme measure. I mean, this is and it's an example of it really doesn't matter who's in office or which party is in office. We can't depend on that. This is happening in Michigan. And if you look beyond just this, the students at the University of Michigan are going through, many, excuse me, many of the same issues as others are. And what makes Michigan different, it's one of only 2 or 3 states where the regents for the universities are elected. So the folks that are in charge are elected by, the residents of Michigan, yet still they're moving forward with this, right? So it's troubling. It's something to keep an eye on, and it is, it's upsetting to see that someone that you thought was an ally or you thought would have the community's back is not only in this instance, but in prior instances over the past few months, aggressively pushed the prosecution of, students and our allies. So it is something we're watching and keeping an eye on.
Can I just add to that? For anybody who watched the footage, and this actually correlates to what we saw in terms of the pushback against protests. I mean, what we're seeing, I think, broadly speaking, across the country, and when you see, FBI in full tactical gear going and breaking down the door at student housing for students who are accused at worst of vandalism, what you're seeing is an operational approach to all things related to Palestine that treats this as terror. And I think it's unmistakable. And it for all of us, that's I think how we have to understand this and we saw this, across the past, more than a year of protests on campus that are met with, with police in full gear, who use violence and use tactics that are generally reserved for those who are using violence themselves, and students are not. But part of this also, I think, is about normalizing in the consciousness of Americans that this is how you treat people who cross the line. And going back to something I think everyone else on this call has said at different times, this starts with Palestine protests, right? It starts with this because this is the easiest thing, but it doesn't end with Palestine protests. And to be clear, anyone who's, I say it starts Palestine protests, I'm hearing in the back of my mind all my colleagues who work on Black Lives Matter and the protests in that era. It isn't just Palestine protests, but this is the issue where it is given license by people who would otherwise stand up and say, how dare you do this? When they saw the police using these brutal tactics against protesters in the Black Lives Matter era, saying this is unacceptable, they don't stand up and say it here, because groups like the ADL and others have basically said, no, 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 you have to understand these people are terrorists, which, by the way, then feeds directly into this administration's broader agenda, which I would argue doesn't care at all about anti-Semitism, doesn't care actually that much about Israel, but has the broader authoritarian goal. And that's why you see these same tactics and the same framing used to go after anyone they want to throw out of the country more broadly. And you get people like Mr. Gorka saying that anybody who's opposing these tactics being used against these evil people may be guilty of violating U.S. anti-terror law. Like literally, he said that if you oppose these tactics, then you are essentially aligning yourselves with terrorism, and that may violate U.S. anti-terror law. So I think it's important to understand what is being normalized with this behavior in the first place.
Thank you for that, Laura. Yeah, and in conclusion, I think you're absolutely right. Once the state grabs power, it very, very rarely ever gives it back. And I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned over time, especially in the post 9/11 era, affecting our generation most directly. But another thing that we learn from the course of studying the history of these kinds of efforts is while repression certainly has an impact of silencing, it also has an impact of outraging people. And there is a point at which people start to understand that, as that song from the 70s went, there's something happening here. And not everybody is necessarily on board with it. One of the things that we saw as the encampments began in Columbia University in 2023 is that a huge number of encampments actually grew after the police were called in to Columbia University. And one has to wonder for how long people here in the United States will sit by and watch as their civil liberties, as their freedoms, which have been hard fought for many, many decades, are being quickly taken away. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today. We appreciate everyone who contributed on this panel and tuned in to watch as well. We appreciate your generosity of time and your thoughts. Please continue to follow the center's work at Arab Center